Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another one of these interviews. I've started this series on my YouTube channel. I'm very excited today because I'm talking to someone who I am a major fan of. Well, I'm a major fan of his Instagram page. And this is the first time I'm, I think, seeing and talking to the person behind the likes, behind the Instagram page. And that page is the Tinmen. It's a wonderful page all about advocating for men in the modern age. But I will let George introduce himself. So, George, tell the viewers a little bit about yourself and also tell us how the Tinmen came to be.
Well, thank you for the kind words, Neel. I'm George. I set up the Tinmen about 2 years ago. I set it up because I didn't want to be part of the conversation with my actual name, although here I am right now, and it's George. I wanted to be part of the conversation because I often found myself excluded for it, or whenever I presented alternate opinions around gender, it always resulted in being shouted at, and like quite aggressively. So I set up a pseudonym, and then I started engaging, because people literally told me to go make my own page. They're like, oh, go make your own page about it. Go make your own. So I did. That's exactly what I did. And I did that. And then I did it for my own personal use. I wanted to have a sort of an archive of useful information, statistically speaking, especially, that I could refer to for my own use. I just wanted to create a private bank of information so I can engage in these conversations responsibly in my real life. So I'd be in pubs and stuff in the UK and London. People would be arguing about this and that in terms of gender, and I'd have my phone beneath the table, sort of referring to issues around like suicide, domestic violence, homelessness, addiction, all the things I talk about. But it was purely for me, my own library of content. And then suddenly it was like 1 follower, 2 followers, 3 followers, and it took a long time. But now it's sort of ramping up, and people are sort of resonating with it. And a bit more about me in my professional life. I'm a filmmaker, but I've always loved all sort of creative mediums. So I like to design, I like to write, I like to draw, I like to animate, and obviously I love film photography. And I just wanted to bring those skills into the Tinmen and create content I thought was like resonated, and really try to, in good faith, have these conversations in a way that was inclusive and not angry. Like I realized my main issue with talking about men's issues. And I hate the term men's rights, and I don't call myself a men's rights advocate. It's just that, yeah. I just think it was a massive brand identity problem. There was this brand identity problem because the discussion of men's issues has always seemed to be by angry white guys, and unfortunately, I'm halfway there. But I really wanted to use my skills in branding and identity to create a series of content that was inclusive and gender neutral and sort of not ideological, and had in good faith and asked people what they thought, because I felt so excluded from the conversation. I always wanted to end with, what do you think? And I still insist the best content on the Tinmen isn't mine, but it's the comments down below. And I always pin them. I always pin the ones I don't agree with. I always pin the ones that I think are worth discussing further. And that's what it's about. It became less of a channel for my own use as it originated, and then it slowly became something that I hope was more useful to others, and about having difficult conversation, expanding compassion. I mean, that's another thing. Like everything, what people don't quite understand is that everything they believe about in terms of women or women's rights, I also believe. Like I believe and sympathise and understand the issues that women go through. What the Tinmen does is it adds a second half to that. It doesn't overlap. It adds, and that's what it's about. Sort of deepening understanding, widening compassion, provoking debate, and it's led me here. And thank you so much for having me on. I wouldn't have got here had it not been for kind individuals such as yourself, Neel, who are able to have difficult conversations and could read information that didn't quite fit in with the popular narrative and weren't afraid to sort of promote it. So thank you.
Well, like I said, I think it's brilliant. I remember seeing it a couple of months ago. I can't remember if one of my followers tagged me in a post or sent a post to me, and it was a statistic. I can't remember what the statistic was now, but it really opened my eyes. It wasn't something I was aware of before. And then I thought, oh, where's this from? And I looked at the page, and before I knew it, it had been an hour, 2 hours of just being shocked, but all these different statistics that I didn't know about and we don't hear about. And it's expressed in such a beautiful and poignant way, and clearly very creative as well. Let's talk a bit further about something you just previously mentioned, which is that the stereotype around well, men's rights, if we want to use that, or just men's advocacy, as you say, does seem to have this kind of resentful tinge to it. And when you think of an MRA, you think of a bitter old man who maybe has been divorced and now is taking that out on all women, notably feminists. Where do you think that stereotype comes from? Do you think it's always true? Do you think it's the exception to the rule? And how do we still advocate for men in this day and age without becoming that stereotype and coming across as resentful?
I think, like feminism, there are multiple different parts of MRA culture. The ones I've experienced have been overwhelmingly positive and actually very liberal, left-leaning sort of people. I found it personally to be a myth that they are all alt-right, sort of very conservative thinkers, because they often, in my experience, they aren't. And I feel like my experience is pretty legitimate, seeing as I have so many of these men following me. And there are also women that call themselves MRAs as well. And the most important thing to say is that regardless of personal experiences of either MRA or feminism, I feel like it's really important to treat people as individuals regardless of whatever group they're from. My first interaction with people, I try my best. I don't always get it right. My first interaction, I always try to come at it with like a fresh perspective. I don't care if you're a feminist. I don't care if you're an MRA. I don't care if you're left or right. I just want to have a conversation with the individual, such as yourself, Neel. And that's why I don't call myself an MRA, and that's also why I don't call myself a feminist. I reluctantly call myself egalitarian, more because that's more of a philosophy than an actual political group. And I try to stay away from left and right, although I am definitely left-leaning. But I mean, with the polarisation of politics, I'm definitely more of a nomad politically now. But I feel like there's definitely, I should also say that I feel like there has been a mischaracterization of MRA for sure. And same for feminism. I feel like both groups have a problem with a very loud and annoying minority of people ruining it for everybody. For everybody. Like if you have a room of reasonable people, it only takes one person shrieking like an idiot to completely alter your opinion of that room of people. But yeah, I stay out of that binary completely of MRA and feminism. I just try and share the content I think is good as an individual. I try to treat people as individuals first, and I hope people can see me as an individual too, outside of that war zone, because it's an absolute mess in my opinion. And I try to not be part of it. Although people do call me an MRA, and I've literally never said it, well, not even once. And I stopped calling myself feminist about 5 years ago for the same reason. I just want to be able to say what I think is right, and I want to be held accountable for my own opinions and my own views, and that's it. I don't want to be held accountable for that guy over there or that woman over there. I just want it to be just me, if possible. But yeah, I think there has been a big mischaracterization, I think, and a lot of MRAs come from difficult experiences like feminism. A lot of them are fathers who have lost children, and if you lost your child to a sexist family court system, you'd be annoyed too. And if you are, especially men who are so often don't have access to the same emotional language as women, when they are sad or fearful or upset, it's easy to lash out of anger. I had a great conversation with my friend River, who runs a mental health charity for men, and he says behind anger is fear. So when we see the angry MRAs, if that trope even exists, try to ask yourself why they're angry. Like, what is it that's making them angry? And often it's a very legitimate cause that you might have some compassion for, if you can actually have a conversation with them. And you're right.
Very good point.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, because even I suppose even just looking back at what I said there, it's very dehumanizing to just say, oh, well, this person's angry and bitter, therefore their views should be discounted or their experiences should be discounted. So we should be asking, well, what made them bitter? What made them resentful? Is it a combination of society and a culture that has maybe forgotten men and sort of looked past male experiences? So that's a very fair point. Yeah. And I think it's something that people should be thinking about.
I feel like you've nailed it. That is it, Neel. You've absolutely got to the secret of the problem, and that's something we afford often to women. When we look at women in prison, for example, we often ask what sort of experiences have put them in there, and often it's they've experienced abuse or sort of trauma in their own right. Maybe they're dealing with poverty. Maybe they've fallen through the cracks of social support. Maybe they're struggling to be a mother. They're under significant pressure. These are the reasons why women can and do sometimes do wrong, and we don't afford that same interrogation to men. They're just written off as toxic or the proponent of the patriarchy, and it's like we don't ask what makes men violent, what makes men display these problematic behaviours. We don't invite those discussions, and anyone that does is sort of outcast, like I am or was. And you're right, we don't ask why, and yeah, we should.
There's this mischaracterization where if you try and delve deeper and you ask why a man may have committed an atrocious act, people tend to think that you're justifying that act or you're somehow making it okay. And that's just not the case. I mean, there has to be a space for nuance there where we can say, all right, what this particular man did is abhorrent. That act is abhorrent, but this is still a human being, and we need to try and obtain justice if there are any victims here, but we also need to try and understand and ascertain how someone could have got to that point, why they got to that point, and how can we prevent that from happening further. And that conversation doesn't seem to be had.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. We just don't invite those conversations. So I can hear someone talking in the background. So can you repeat that, Neel?
That's not good. Oh, I was just saying, what I just said there was basically, I think you heard most of it. It was essentially about how we aren't allowed the space to ask the question, all right, why did this man maybe commit this heinous act?
Understanding.
What could have led, what sort of conditions can contribute to this? But instead it's just one label is put on it, toxic or, privileged, harmful. And there's a certain truth to a lot of that for sure. But we also need to delve deeper, because what are we trying to do here? Are we trying to just have this kind of gender war, or are we trying to make things better for everyone? And, we need to humanize everyone. And that includes people who have committed heinous acts. We need to try and understand why they got to that point, how they got to that point. And that, as you say, is afforded to some identities. But particularly white men, it's just that idea that they're actually lacking in that privilege in many ways. It's just immediately assumed this person's toxic. Let's just write them off as a human being. We should be able to say, all right, what they did was abhorrent. They need to be punished. But let's try and unpack how they got to that point.
Yeah, no one wants to ask us questions on how someone became toxic. I mean, we all know that no one's born bad. No one's born bad or capable of doing these things. I mean, some people are, for sure, but the vast majority of people who do bad things aren't born that way. So they must have experienced something on their journey. We always just identify the end product of problematic male behaviour and never the journey that person's been on to arrive there. And if we did, we'd understand and maybe have a little bit more compassion for them. And again, I'll repeat what you said because it's really, really important. Understanding these things is not justifying them. Like a violent man who's experienced childhood abuse and everything else, understanding that journey he's been on is the only way we can actually solve the problem. And if you're not willing to have that conversation, which is difficult and requires like a maturity and a distance, then you're not actually, I don't know how much you're helping the cause. And that's what we need to do. I mean, there's a really great, there was a great bit of research that looked at young boys in school that had violent fantasies, young men who had violent fantasies, and they found that I think about 97% of boys who were the most bullied boys in school had violent fantasies later in life. So here we have these men who are having violent fantasies, fantasizing about committing violence. And again, our narrow perspective of that man would be toxic. But we don't understand that 97% of the boys who went through school being bullied became that man. And the reason why they developed those violent fantasies was as a way of preparing themselves for violence to come. Like if you've been sort of marinated in violence as a child, as a young boy, you learn to have violent fantasies as a way of preparing yourself mentally for more violence. So the men that are having these violent fantasies, instead of calling them toxic, if we ask questions about why they became that way, maybe we would find similar causes within their childhood, difficult experiences and bullying in school, again, abuse. Same for looking at prisons. There's a reason why there's a disproportionate amount of homeless men in prison, or men who are addicted to drugs, or men who are sort of alcoholic, or men who lived in poverty, or men who have, again, experienced abuse or childhood trauma. That didn't happen by pure coincidence. And we're not willing to explore those roots because so much of our discussion on gender is purely about not wanting to have those discussions because they're unpopular. But unpopular doesn't mean wrong. And we need to be unafraid to have these unpopular discussions that we're having right now. And if you're not, then you're not. I just feel like you're not solving the problem. You're just making noise. And
without a doubt.
Yeah, and it's just it's so annoying. So you see the same when you talk about like men who experience violence. Whenever you want to have that conversation, like the men who walk home and get assaulted. Whenever you say like, well, men walking home are more likely to be assaulted than women in the UK. Whenever you say that, it's always like, well, buy other men, and it's like, well, if you're more interested,
again, that's
yeah, it's just like it doesn't.
Well, it's a deflection. It's a way to dehumanize the person and deflect their experiences and not really. It always seems to be when we do explore these experiences and issues further. Well, it's still men's fault.
Yeah,
it's always men's fault, and it's men's responsibility to fix it. And to be fair, there's a certain truth to all of this, but. As you say, a lot of these conversations are unpopular, but they're also uncomfortable because some of the things that I've learned from your page is that some of the causes for these problems don't fit into a certain ideological or cultural narrative. A slideshow you posted recently showed that it was, if I remember correctly, it was a 2019 study in Canada that showed mothers and women also exhibit what could be called toxic masculinity towards their male children more so than they do to their female children, and that doesn't fit the narrative, does it? And it's not, it'll be a hard ask to somehow mold that to still make it men's fault. So that's a big reason why people don't want to delve deeper, because sometimes the things they may uncover are uncomfortable. I remember I do these stories, these sort of anonymous stories on my Instagram page where I allow people to express themselves and maybe certain experiences they've had. And one question I asked a couple of months ago was 50% of men have said that when they have opened up, because that's what we're told to do, to open up and, talk about your feelings, and then you'd be less toxic. And to be fair, that's very true. We should talk about it. We should listen when other men open up. But 50% of men who have opened up feel like they've been punished for it. And we immediately think, well, that's other men saying you're a pussy, you're a bitch, stop crying, you're gay, or whatever it may be. But a lot of these people who sent in passages, sometimes just multiple paragraphs, was saying that it was their partners, it was their mothers, it was their romantic interests, it was people who you wouldn't necessarily expect to be the ones exhibiting those sorts of norms that were in fact exhibiting them. And it actually, I got a lot of messages from female followers saying this has opened my eyes, I'm shocked that these women actually exist. And it reminds me of another slide you posted recently where, women are also capable of being, well, I don't want to say evil, but being the antagonist, being mean and being toxic and being assholes. So there's
as much as men.
If you just view the world through this collective lens, it's really limiting, and it can also be quite harmful.
We do. People seem to want to. I mean, obviously, we're all for women's autonomy, but people seem to end autonomy when it comes to sort of problematic actions. Everyone seems to think that women are only capable of good, whereas I think they're capable of both good and also bad, as capable as men, actually. And again, that's another limitation of our conversation. It was actually put really well by Margaret Atwood, who is a feminist, who said women aren't saints, and they're just as capable of problematic behaviour as anyone else. And again, we need to sort of open our eyes to where we can get it right and get it wrong, because again, when we talk about sort of gender norms that hurt men, we only seem to identify the places where they come from when it's another man doing it, which I do agree with is a problem. I did a post where it was about what are the expectations that hurt men, and often they're about sort of being a provider, being successful, having status, not sharing their emotions, the ones that we all know. But again, when we identify where they come from, we just seem to limit women. And like, women are just as capable as men. Women contribute to society just as much as men do. The idea that women don't feed into these societal norms at all, I think is kind of misogynistic. And like, we just have a look at the slideshow. I think you're talking about. I shared some information on dating standards, where men are more likely in dating to sort of prioritize body size and attractiveness, physical attractiveness, which is clearly a source for the toxic attitudes that hurt women. But when they asked women, it was more often around sort of money and job status and financial security, which is also important. And so, well, what do you think that does? If we're looking for men who are successful and stable and have great jobs and high status and have a lot of sort of wealth and sort of assets, then where does that lead us? And the study you talked about, I think it's Professor Crystal Tomlinson. She's Canadian, and she's a professor of child adolescent psychology, and she found that mothers were even more capable of sort of limiting emotional expression in boys, and they were more accepting of girls showing anger and sadness than they were boys, and they actually found that dads had no gender preference when it came to sort of emotional expression. They didn't really care, but she found that it was typically mothers who were perpetuating these boys can't cry, boys shouldn't express their emotions, and it's just that needs to at least be considered. At least allow that conversation to happen. I'm not saying that is just one sentence in the conversation. Well, it's just one study, and I'm not basing my entire opinion on that. But it's interesting, and there's also research that says the opposite. And I feel like we need to be inclusive of all these different studies, and as well as being diverse in terms of gender and sexuality and culture and race. We need to be diverse in ideas and perspectives, and not just limit the ones that we like and are likable and popular online. We need to look at the ugly side of these issues as well, without legitimizing them or condoning them, and certainly not perpetuating them. But there's a lot more to it.
Yeah, people seem to really delve deep into the complexity when it's a certain racial minority or it's a gender that is not isn't male, aren't men, but. It seems to be very simplified when it comes to men. Let's go back to the dating preferences that you spoke about just then. How much can we actually change that? Because how much of our preferences are innate and biological, and then we get into this discussion about essentialism versus social construction. So how much do you think of our dating preferences and maybe what the average man or what men, the sort of aggregate straight male, what they might look for in a partner, and vice versa, the aggregate straight woman, what they might look for in a partner? How much of that can we actually change? How much of that is malleable?
I mean, I obviously have to start by saying I'm no expert in sort of neuroscience or psychology, but my answer would be the boring one, where it's sort of where biologically, I think men and women are biologically different, and that's enhanced by culture. And I'm not saying all men are different to all women, but generally speaking, we are different. We are different in our behaviours, and that feeds into dating, and it feeds into the jobs we choose, and it feeds into how we sort of conduct ourselves. And there's got to be some sort of malleability, or at least we should try it and at least explore how malleable it is. We should sort of set our ambitions here, and even if we can't reach them, we're still making progress along that road. But I do think men and women are, in general, biologically different, and I think a lot of that comes down to hormones. There's a really good book called The Male Brain by, I hope his name's right, Professor Luann Bresendine, who's a neuroscientist, and she wrote a lot about the female brain, New York Times bestseller, and then she brought out a second book, The Male Brain, and she talked about how the brains and bodies of boys and girls before puberty are very similar. If you look at a boy and a girl before puberty, they are very similar in terms of height and sort of physique. But when they hit puberty, they completely change into the bodies of men and women that we have today, where they change height, they change their sort of their body composition, their shape, and she argues that the same happens to the brain. Our brains become very different through puberty as they interact with hormones, testosterone and estrogen, most of all, and they shape our typically gendered behaviour. And those, I think those exist on a biological level, but then are perpetuated and enhanced through culture. And then, that'll feed into our dating, and that'll feed into many different parts. And I have no idea where the line is in terms of what's biological and what is social and cultural. And I wouldn't want to draw that line. I feel like there's another thing that was the problem with social media. Everyone likes to pretend that they're an expert, and people shouldn't be afraid to be like, I don't know. I don't know. These are all my opinions based on some research and some reading. But overall, I wouldn't want to comment
very
too
refreshing
heavily.
to hear that.
Yeah. Well, doesn't it for a good podcast? It's like, I know I did.
It's 1 hour of us just not knowing. But I think what you said is it would be hard to argue against that. Again, I haven't done an incredible amount of research. Another great book is Testosterone by, it's just called that, and I've completely forgotten the author. She was on the Joe Rogan Experience recently, of course. Straight man watches the Joe Rogan Experience. But that was a fascinating look into very similar themes, how testosterone actually affects men's brains and how it also affects our behaviour. And it really sort of it comes into conflict with the idea that all of our behaviours and all of our attitudes are socially learned. And as you say, I wouldn't bet against some of our behaviours being socially learned and some of them being biological. I just wonder, especially the conversation with dating, I also have looked into studies about racial preferences when it comes to dating, and there's a clear preference for white men. Now, does that mean all women or anyone who's looking to date men is inherently racist? I don't think so. I think there's some sort of social, maybe there's some cultural issues at play there, but also maybe there is some kind of biological issues at play there. But I think we're so quick to jump into, there's some sort of discrimination or there's some sort of pernicious attitudes that have been bred by a toxic culture that has led to these disparities, when in many instances disparities, whether they be in professional areas of life or dating or wherever they may be, they just naturally occur, and it's part of being human to accept those disparities. Now, if certain people get left behind and it affects their mental health to a really detrimental level, then I think as a society we have to start looking at that and asking the question, can we do something to help these people who are falling behind? But I don't think just seeing disparities wherever they may lay is automatically call for concern. But as you've articulated so well on your page and in this interview so far, it's something to explore, and we have to be willing to look into that, and not just when it suits someone's narrative. We have to be able to ask questions.
Yeah, or at least have the conversation. Like, I'm not saying everything I say is 100% right all the time. I'm just saying this is a useful conversation to at least have. But often we don't even go that far. Often the conversation ends before it even begins, and the person wanting to have it is sort of cancelled, and as a consequence, just pushed further into the extreme. That the more we disallow these conversations, the more those people want to have them, and the more pissed off they become, and the more sort of more extreme the behaviour, unfortunately. And I just feel like we need to learn how to have discourse in a way that isn't personal, and separating politics from our identity as a person. And that's another thing that put me off the whole feminist MRA binary, is that so many of these ideas are political, but they're also we badge ourselves with them as people. I am an MRA, or I am a feminist. And once you identify as your political beliefs, it's so much harder to change them. It's so much harder to change who you are and how you identify. Absolutely. And I feel like, I'm not a religious person either, and I feel like I see a similar thing where if you suggest anything outside of that sort of political, that ideological viewpoint, it never ends well. People don't look at it in a dispassionate neutral point of view. They always look at it in a way of protecting what they believe rather than sort of challenging it. And nothing good comes from that. Nothing good comes from a set of beliefs that can't be challenged or made unfalsifiable. Like when we look at patriarchy, for example, it's just impossible to falsify it. There's no way of proving it wrong because it's so vaguely formulated. And I feel like there are much better ways to describe the world that talk about the same thing, that are more scientific and more sort of less divisive, more scientific, more useful, testable. Whenever it's like if you talk to someone who believes the Earth is 10,000 years old, if you show them a fossil that's 1,000,000 years old, they don't use it as an opportunity to sort of reflect and challenge their own beliefs. They use it as an opportunity to protect what they believe. They're like, no, God planted those fossils. That's a test. And the same for patriarchy. If we say, well, why are men at the very bottom of society? Yes, men are at the top. No one can deny that, and I certainly don't. But why are they at the bottom? And then the people, they don't look at it as a chance to be like, well, maybe this viewpoint of society is too narrow. They don't look at like expanding it or challenge it. It's always about defending it and protecting it from falsification. And it's like, no, well, that's because men aren't da-da-da-da-da, and then you can insert any number of mental gymnastics, and it's just when someone starts backflipping and sort of challenging semantics and like blurring the boundaries, it's just like, it's not helpful, I don't think. And again,
I
so
read
going back to it, yeah. I was just going to say, yeah. So going back to just identifying as any sort of political belief system, I think can and often does become a problem. Which is why I just try to call myself, George. Everyone's like, "What do you call yourself?" I'm like, "I call myself a George." So just call me that, please.
We can all be George.
Yeah, well, no, please don't.
I read a study a couple of months ago, and it said that if you have a strongly held belief that you have an emotional attachment to, that makes up your identity. When you're faced with contradictory evidence, you're more likely to actually become even further entrenched in whatever belief system that may be. So it has the opposite effect. And I've tried to notice that in myself because I don't think I'm completely immune to this. All right, where am I getting particularly pent up about and defensive? What does that say about how I identify and how I see myself, and what facet of my identity do I feel like is being challenged here? Do I feel like is being attacked? So I think it's worthwhile to just observe that in yourself, and when you're scrolling through social media now, when everything on social media is so emotionally laden and intense, see what does, get your shoulder, notice yourself. Oh, that's making me angry. Oh, that's making me a bit pissed off. Well, what does that say about your identity, or maybe a belief that you're not willing to let go of or question? And that's helped me a lot. That's I don't think I'm perfect at it yet. I know anyone who watches this channel knows there are certain things that will still irk me and get on my nerves, but I think that's the goal, especially with social media the way it is today. I think we have to try and be as without sounding too zen or too hippie here, we have to try and just separate ourselves from our ego and how we may identify ourselves, and that also refers to whatever political belief we may identify with. Something I wanted to ask you is, where do you see this going? Because I do see I do sense this sort of burgeoning, if we want to call it men's movement, or just people are talking about the male experience now more. And it's not just your page. I'm seeing people who I wouldn't have expected talk about how things are starting to become quite difficult for men in certain areas. Where do you see this going? Do you think a new male identity in the West is, we're on the cusp of that? Do you think there'll be a reactionary sentiment and people will try and go back to how things were 50, 60, 70 years ago? Where do you see this going in 5 to 10 years? What do you think it will be like to be a man?
Well, one of the unanswered questions I have, and I can't really answer, is what do we call it? I don't know what we call it. It's just this undefined movement, we'll call it. I just like egalitarianism as an idea, so let's just call it that. Because that obviously doesn't leave women behind. The last thing we need is to start something that's just the complete opposite of what I think we're experiencing, where men are being left behind or excluded from the conversation. And so if we create an opposite one where women are excluded from it, then it literally is completely pointless, and often it ignores the fact that the issues that I discuss are symbiotically related to one's women experience. So they're all linked together, and we need to sort of solve both sides of the equation. Where is it going? I think I'm positive about it. Like, I interviewed Erin Pitsey earlier this year for my podcast, and she set up the first abuse refuge in the world for women 50 years ago. So she's seen a long time frame of sort of progress, and her story's fantastic. So she set up the world's first refuge for women in London, and she basically started opening buildings right across London to house women that had been abused through squatting. So just going into them, sitting there, taking over, and then getting women in, and then moving on, next house, get them in. And then it wasn't long before she started to realise a lot of the women that were coming to her were also abusive too. And she started to see that domestic violence was not a gendered issue, and women were often perpetuating it back to their husbands. It wasn't necessarily one person being abusive. Most domestically abusive relationships are mutually abusive. So she tried to open a refuge for men, and that's where it all went wrong. It all went wrong. She got shut down. All the people that were funding her shelters decided not to fund the men's shelter, and she ended up getting thrown out of her own charity. And now she lives on income support. She lives on income support in an attic, one bedroom attic flat in London. The woman that set up the first refuge in the world, who saved the lives of countless women, now lives on benefit support because she wanted to do what was.
Can you repeat her name again? Sorry.
Erin Pitsey, Pizzey. National hero, I think, but no one knows who she is. Yeah. So it's like. And she is, I mean, I don't want to, this is not a negative story, because I interviewed her and she's like, she feels it's all going to change in the next few years. She thinks in her lifetime it's going to change. So we're talking the next 5 or 10 years, or hopefully a lot longer for her. But she's very positive. She thinks lots happening, a lot of research, especially research by women. There's a lot of women's-led research coming out into domestic violence, particularly, that's showing the male survivor, male victim. What I want to do, I don't want to remain just an angry rectangle on your phone that's just like, ah. But I do recognise the fact that any change starts with discussion and awareness. But I do have some ideas of how I want to sort of influence things, actually change things, actually make political change, and sort of motivate people to ask for that change. I mean, I can talk about it, but that's all sort of in the distant future. But I mean, all change starts with a conversation, and I feel like we're quite embryonic in terms of whatever this undefined movement is. It's still very early, but it's growing. Like, if we had this conversation this time last year, I had like 3,000 followers, and now it's grown like almost 10 times the size.
Wow.
So it's changed a lot. I mean, we just had International Men's Day yesterday, and there's a lot more people talking about it. A lot of people, a lot of universities and brands wanted to promote International Men's Day for the last few years, and it's almost always resulted in them being shouted down, cancelled, and then them cancelling. But a few brands have actually been like, no, we are going to do International Men's Day. Google still haven't done their Google Doodle for International Men's Day, but maybe next year. But I've seen a lot more people being more open and honest about their compassion for men, because that's all it is. It's like, why is expanding compassion to men so unpopular? Like, it doesn't detract from our compassion to women or any other gender. It's an addition and a necessary one, and it shouldn't be unpopular. Like, I genuinely feel like I'm more progressive than just about anyone, because I agree with these ideas about what women experience, and then I'm just adding, and there's nothing more progressive than that. So I think people are realising that, and I think it's just down to education and people being sick and tired of being scared to say what they think. And myself included, I don't share. I've never shared a single Tinmen post on any of my personal profiles. But some of my friends do, and I'm seeing it happen more. And the trajectory I'm on, and I've seen others on, I think is a positive thing. And I think, 5 or 10 years we'll be having a very different conversation to the one we're having now. There are real change. I mean, Australia, for sure, is leading the way. They're genuinely leading the way in how we deal with men's mental health. Who is it? Let me find out. It's shout out to the Australian Australian Men's Health Forum. They're basically redefining the way we talk about men's mental health and sort of encouraging a new approach. And there's great things happening in Australia. The UK
is
is...
that the one I saw? I was just really quickly. I saw an article a couple of years ago where they reframed some of the terms associated with men's mental health, changing it to something like mental fitness as opposed to mental health, and how that resonates with men a lot more. Yeah. And is that what you're talking about? Is that the...
well, they basically... So there's a growing belief that within sort of therapy, a lot of it's developed to meet the needs of women. And although men and women are fairly similar, they're also not the same. So people think that a lot of talk therapy isn't as effective on men, and we need to explore new approaches to sort of therapeutic interventions. My friend River, who I mentioned earlier, runs a mental health charity for men that does group talks all across the UK, and the non-clinical, anonymous, judgment-free spaces for men to talk, not in like therapy rooms, but in like pubs, restaurants, cafes, sitting rooms. And I think that's very effective. I think going to the gym, exercise is very effective for both men and women, but particularly for men. I think we need to at least explore this. Like, maybe I'm wrong, but we won't know that until we actually ask the question and have these discussions. And the Australian Men's Health Forum has done a lot to sort of meet men at where they are. Because there's a great study in Australia where the number one reason for men not returning to therapy was because they just didn't feel a connection with their therapist. And
I saw that. That was very eye-opening.
And again, like, if we're gonna look at the financial industry, which is 80% men, and that often creates an environment and a style of work which is more suitable for men, which I accept. If a boardroom is 80% men, it's going to create a work system that's 80% that benefits 80% of people. But in therapy, a lot of the psychology industry is women, and we should probably ask the same question of that. Like, what sort of culture is that creating? What sort of solutions is that creating? What sort of language is coming out of these spaces? And how do we bring a male perspective into therapy? I know the APA in America, the American Psychological Association, I think it's called. They've just announced their guidance on working with men and boys about a year or two ago. And this is basically a guidance for all therapists in America, I believe, on how to talk to men and boys. And they've gone the other way, unfortunately. They're talking about patriarchy and they're talking about how the gender is a social construction. And that's more worrying. But I think Australia, we need to do more of what you guys are doing and less of what the Americans are doing. And I don't know what the British are doing, but somewhere probably in the middle. But there was another really good piece.
We're leading the way in something.
Yeah, no, genuinely. I had a talk with. I talked to my friend Susie. I was talking to my friend Susie. I talked to my friend Susie, who's a suicide researcher. She's basically I'm helping her research suicide in men, and she's amazing research. And she would not stop talking about how great Australia's doing in terms of mental health. And we were both like high-fiving over our podcast about how great it is over there. And we should all take a page of the Aussies' books.
Oh, yeah. Well, that makes me very proud, actually. So,
yeah.
Even though I didn't do anything, but good for the people leading the way here in Australia. I can only attest to my personal experience, and every time I've gone through a really sort of tough time in my life, it was one particular moment a couple of years ago. It was a pretty bad breakup. Talking helped a little bit. It helped in the short term, speaking to friends, speaking to family members. But what really helped me was sort of giving myself some goals and little achievements and going to the gym and actually embracing my masculinity. Yeah. I sort of grew up being in the arts. I developed this identity where, I'm not like the football players. I'm a lot more sensitive and intellectual, and these are just dumb stereotypes. Like, who's to say that a sports player or a rugby player or someone who maybe is very muscly and masculine isn't also sensitive and isn't also very, not a meathead. But this association with masculinity as only being toxic and harmful and being associated with meatheads and people who exhibit those sorts of traits aren't intelligent. These are, it's not true in my life, at least in my personal experience. And in fact, it's helped me a hell of a lot being masculine in at least what I would regard a positive way. Do you think that's limiting? Because when we think about masculinity, just automatically we think toxic. I mean, there's two different schools of thought there, because some people who use the term toxic masculinity, well, the two phrases toxic masculinity, there. Some people are saying everything associated with masculinity is toxic and harmful, whereas some people, and I would agree with this view to a certain extent, will be saying that certain aspects of masculinity are harmful and are, let me just, off the top of my head, the obvious stereotype, someone who thinks that, a man opening up about their feelings makes them weak and they should just try and conquer every woman that they see, regardless of whether they're in a relationship or not. Yeah, like that's obviously... I would call that toxic, right? But then going to the gym and, even developing your strength and sort of being emotionally resilient without being closed off and repressed, I think that's very positive. It will, at least from my personal experience, that has been very positive. I can't attest to everyone else out there. But do you think the lack of nuance surrounding the conversation about masculinity is actually quite harmful?
Yeah, totally. We talk a lot about the man box, which is a school of thought I do subscribe to. The man box is the box we put men into, the one of the provider, the warrior, the hero, the disposable, the guy. Like this idea, but a very narrow view of masculinity, and we're taking men out of that now. We're saying men don't have to be the providers, they don't have to be stoic, they don't have to be heroes, they don't have to be dominant. But then we're putting them into a second set of boxes, which is like privilege, fragility. Toxic. Like, I want to do away with all these narrow definitions of masculinity, and I want to get rid of the stoic, emotionless, heroic side, and I also want to get rid of the woke one, which is like privilege, fragility, dominance, whatever, toxicity. As for specifically the term toxic masculinity, no, I've always hated it, mainly because masculinity isn't toxic, first of all, but people do become toxic. And using the term toxic masculinity doesn't seem to invite us, again, to inquire into what makes these people toxic. What sort of experiences has this toxic man experienced? I'll use a story, a true story, from Susie, the researcher I mentioned. She was on a train in Scotland. And in Scotland, alcohol and drug addiction has overtaken suicide as the number one cause of male death. Young men, and she was on a train, and there was a young man who had drunk like I think he drank like 4-pack of really strong cider in the morning, and he catcalled a woman on the train. And again, as we're going back to what you said, this is nothing condones sexual harassment, but everyone made sure this woman was okay, quite rightly so. But no one seemed willing to ask the man what sort of man has experienced. What sort of experience has that man had that leads him to be that reliant on alcohol and have that sort of behaviour first thing in the morning, to be drunk on a public train? And instead of inquiring to what makes someone toxic, of which he clearly is, we just call him toxic, and we just say you're toxic, rather than the experiences you may have had makes someone toxic. So I mean, I prefer to use the term toxic attitudes toward masculinity, which everyone perpetuates, and everyone has their own sort of individual ones, and they often become internalised by men, and then that makes them toxic. But either way, it's a very narrow point of view. Going back to the gym thing, I think the gym's great. I love going to the gym. I haven't been able to go as much recently as possible, but I did go last week, and I went to the preacher bench, and there was a cup of coffee on it, and I was like, "Who is that? Whose is that?" So I looked around, and I found a personal trainer whose coffee it was, and I walked up to him, and I calmed down, and we had a really good conversation. And he made me a cup of coffee. He's like, "Do you want a cup of coffee?" I was like, "Yeah." And then we had a cup of coffee. We were chatting, drinking our coffee in the gym. Turns out he runs a chess club. And he's sensational, quote to him, at chess. So we were there talking about chess. We're going to go and play, drinking our coffee in the gym. And I was like, that is the essence of masculinity. We're here in the gym, but we're chatting, having a great time. And what a wholesome experience. And I think exercise is very important to people's mental health. All people, especially me, and it wouldn't surprise me if more so for men, because there's just something so healing about it. But no, I don't like the term toxic masculinity at all.
I just wanted to jump in there really quickly. I read somewhere, if I can remember correctly, that there's actually a correlation between testosterone and negative and positive mental health outcomes for men. The higher their testosterone, they seem to be less likely to experience things like depression. Now,
yeah,
obviously we all know correlation doesn't mean causation, but there's clearly something there to explore further.
Yeah, Dr. Deborah So, who's another very controversial writer, but she's studied PhD in neuroscience. So I mean, she's not an idiot, but she left academia because she was so tired of this conversation that was this big, and she became a journalist. And she writes in her book End of Gender about how the same thing, like masculinity often is associated with positive mental health outcomes, and the behaviours that are associated with toxic masculinity are better explained by sort of AntiSociality, and which is separate to masculinity. And it's just a weird thing that we define masculinity by what it isn't and where it goes wrong. And for no other group would we do that. We define men by either their privilege, the privilege experienced by a tiny majority of hyper-successful men, the CEOs, the politicians, the business owners, the billionaires, and we use that to define all men. The pyramid like this, the men on the very top becomes the monolith for all men, and we do the same for behaviour. We take a minority of problematic men who exist, and we use that as a archetype for all of masculinity, and then like everyone's like, well, toxic masculinity doesn't mean all masculinity is toxic. And it's like, well, it does. Like semantically, you put those two words together, that's the association you're going to start creating. And people just don't want to change it. And I'm always like, if this many people are misinterpreting toxic masculinity as a semantic coupling, then maybe the problem is the phrase. And if we just said toxic attitudes toward masculinity, we could just solve it and just move on and agree. Like, I always... Yeah, no, it annoys me. And it's like the same thing happens to women, where women sort of display what some would call toxic femininity. And I reject that equally. But often we look at those as a product of her experiences. Like, why do women feel they have to be small or polite or petite or submissive? Why do they feel that way? Well, the answer is because they live in a society that has these toxic attitudes towards women, and they inhibit them, and we call it internalized misogyny. But for men, we don't look at how they inhibit toxic attitudes toward masculinity from society. We just call them toxic, and we don't inquire or interrogate the journey they've been on and why they feel that way. Because men are just inherently bad, apparently, and then we start straying into sort of again agency and autonomy, and men seem to be responsible for everything, and women the opposite. So yeah, I mean, I just think society, we have gendered. The boring truth is that society has gendered attitudes and expectations that hurt men and also women. But for women, we call it internalized misogyny, which is more or less correct. But for men, it's made part of who they are, and they become toxic themselves.
Well said. Let's talk a bit more about the responsibility that you just touched on. Now, how do you respond to the general sentiment that all men play a part or have some sort of role or responsibility at dismantling these sorts of toxic attitudes towards women and toxic attitudes about masculinity that they've maybe internalized? Because to me, I think that's a very fair point. We all have a part to play in society if we're just exhibiting certain characteristics that we may not even be consciously aware of, and it's worth doing some kind of self-interrogation there. The issue I have is the hypocrisy when it comes to other groups. So when it comes to, say, the typical response to that is like, well, we don't judge all Muslims and say that every peaceful Muslim is responsible for the very small minority who commit acts of terrorism. So why is it that every individual man is responsible for dismantling certain attitudes that lead to and perpetuate certain acts of violence? I just don't understand the hypocrisy there, and it frustrates me, to be quite honest, because, if I walk down the street and someone crosses the road and then someone asks that person, all right, why'd you cross the road? And it was a woman, and she said, oh, well, because he was brown. Everyone would say, well, that's disgusting. You shouldn't have done that. You should never have crossed the road because he was brown. Whereas if someone then asked her, all right, why'd you cross the road? And she said, oh, because he was a man. Well, then that's entirely justified. Now, I don't have a problem with people crossing the road. They can do whatever they want. I'm not trying to say, my feelings are more important than someone who's maybe experienced horrible acts from a man or from a man who looks a certain way, but it's the hypocrisy that really gets to me. How would you unpack something like that?
I mean, I can't really explain it. I don't know how I agree with you. It is hypocritical. And I do feel like it's important to say that we are all entitled to change our behaviour to make ourselves feel safe, within reason. I'm not saying you have to, if you see a man walking down the road at night time, you can't cross the street. Of course you can, but you just need to be aware of the consequences of your decisions and what sort of culture that creates. Of course, last year we saw the death of George Floyd, and the world, understandably, myself included, protested Black Lives Matter. And I'd always known quite a lot about police brutality, because 96% of people killed by police in America are men. And if you look specifically at black populations in America, it's literally 99% black men and 1%, less than 1% women. So there is clearly a gender angle. It's not just black people being killed; it's black men and men as a class, overwhelmingly so, like 96%. But no one seemed willing to explore that. And then a year later in the UK, so this year, Sarah Everard was murdered by a police officer, and that became a massive campaign that quickly became quite divisive between the genders, where women were encouraged to be afraid of men, and literally had Saatchi, big advertising agency, launching campaigns about how men can help women feel safer on the streets, and literally giving guidance like cross the road or put your hood down, hands out your pockets, hood down. And it was just incredible when I saw that, because I was like, who is going to pay the price for your vilification of men as a class? It's going to be black men mainly. They are already seen as dangerous, which they are not, and this sort of this real fear mongering of men is going to be felt by minority men, particularly in the UK, and literally feed into the very problem that caused the George Floyd thing. And once these feelings of fear become inhibited by police, then we're going to see the same thing again. There's a really sad parallel that I drew where when Saatchi and Women's Aid released the whole campaign about how men can make women feel more safe, one of them literally was hood down, hands out. And I knew that rang a bell, because that's when Trayvon Martin was killed by George Zimmerman a few years ago, there was a whole campaign of encouraging black boys to put their hoods down, because George Zimmerman killed Trayvon Martin because he had his hood up. So that was used as a means of seeing us as dangerous. And I was just like, there's an interesting parallel where we're no longer vilifying just black men, but all men. And it's going to be doubly felt, compounded by racism, by black men in particular. So it was just sad to see the same people advocating to end police brutality, then, in my opinion, feeding into the very sort of groupthink that shapes it and enhances it. But I had a conversation with a friend of mine who was a feminist, long conversations, and she was like, when I walk home, I'm not afraid of women, I am afraid of men. And I feel like that's understandable. And similar for me too, if I'm honest. And I don't feel like you should be not crossing the street and giving people space. I just feel like there needs to be an awareness of the consequences of this behaviour. And if you are, and it just needs to be, it has to be measured, and it has to be sort of realistic, and it has consequences. And I just think we need to have a great awareness of what happens when we treat men like this, and how it impacts them, and also recognising feeling safe isn't the same as being safe. Like men crossing the road and taking their hands out of their pockets and putting their hoods down, and announcing their arrival was one of the things I thought was funny. That doesn't make women safe. That only helps them feel safe. And feeling safe isn't being safe. The way we help women and men, all people, be safe is by talking about the causes of violence, rather than, again, the end product of violent men. Like what causes crime, poverty maybe, or addiction, or again abuse. Like how do we arrive here? How do we deal with the root causes so women and men don't feel safe but actually are safe? Otherwise, we're just pretending. Because actual violent men don't care about hoods. They don't care about these campaigns. They're violent, and they're violent for a reason. And until we look at those reasons, I don't think anything's going to change. But yeah, everyone should be wary of their own personal safety whilst walking home, for sure, men included.
Yeah.
And we should all moderate our behaviour a little bit, I think.
Yeah, I would never judge someone for taking reasonable precautions if they feel fear or. And like I said earlier, I wouldn't, I don't think my feelings really play a part in that. If someone does choose to cross the street, sometimes I've walked around with a hoodie and I tend to have a very stoic look on me all the time. And I do look, people have told me, you look scary. And part of me is like, well, thank you. I take that as a bit of a compliment. But I saw one really bizarre thing, sort of sentiment when that very unfortunate incident happened in the UK. Someone was saying how I just wish sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I want to walk down to the beach at 2 a.m, but I can't do that because I'm a woman. Now, I'm not trying to say that, I would ever understand that experience, but I don't think I wouldn't walk down to the beach at 2 a.m. That's I don't think anyone can really do that.
I was walking home the other night from my friends in South East London, and I was stupid about having my headphones in, head down, was walking my dog, and then I saw a shadow in the corner of my eye, span around, and there was like a woman standing there who was just walking innocently behind me. I literally screamed. I was like, ah! I was literally scared, and I was just like, I'm 6'2", I'm also quite scary looking, but I was like, I feel fear too. When I'm walking home, when the light's above my head, I look at the shadow beneath me. I can see my shadow walking, so I can see if someone's behind me. If I can walk in the road, I do, so I can see behind cars. And I get scared. If we want to talk about encouraging men to express themselves, then accept the fact that they can also be as afraid as women walking home at night. We're not immortal. Yes, we often have a greater physical capacity to defend ourselves, but that is completely eliminated when someone has a knife. And also, it still hurts. Yep. It still hurts. And again, people go, well, buy other men. And I'm like, I'm sorry. I didn't realise crime didn't matter if you share a gender of the person doing it. It's like, that's not how it works. And
and again, that's another point of hypocrisy that I don't understand, because you wouldn't say when there's a very high incidence of black-on-black crime, you wouldn't sort of diminish the experiences of a black victim by saying, well, by other black men. Yeah. It's just ridiculous if you said something like that. So
there's a lot of research showing that the most abusive relationships are same-sex women, which is kind of crazy considering there's no man even involved in that relationship. But you would never look at a lesbian woman abusing another lesbian woman and be like, guess what? Both lesbians, therefore, cancel each other out. See you later. But we just seem to so quickly do that for men who are assaulting other men, and it's like, it doesn't offer any comfort for the man being assaulted. He's not stabbing himself. He's not robbing himself. There's two different men there, and I guess that comes back to our perspective of men is monolithic. We see them as all part of this problematic group, and they're responsible for their own actions, and they share responsibility. And if a man robs another man, then that's too bad, and so it's his own fault, and it's just victim blaming. A woman that is sexually harassed for her outfit, we don't blame the outfit, but we seem to blame men's gender if they experienced a crime walking home themselves, and it's like, both are inexcusable, and it doesn't mean any less if I'm assaulted because I'm a man and I share a gender. I know, and when the whole Sarah Everard thing happened, there was so many memes online about One of them was interesting. It was like, if I give you a bowl of Smarties and one of these Smarties has poison on it, you wouldn't take a handful. And I was just like, that is the same, and I mean the same, literally the same meme that Donald Trump's son, whose name I don't know and I don't care to know, he tweeted the same thing about Muslim immigrants. He was like, oh, well, if we have a bowl of Smarties and some of them are poisoned, you wouldn't want all of these Muslim immigrants in America. I was just like, it's the same. You put them side by side, they're the same. Men, Muslims. And one of them is absolutely, they're both disgusting. But this one is, we openly see that as disgusting. And I was just like, it's just, sometimes I feel like I'm living in a dream. And I see stuff like that. It's just so blatantly hypocritical and disheartening.
And I hear something like that, and I try to be, non-ideological as much as possible. I know human beings always have things that they may be irrationally attached to, but when I see something like that espoused by a certain part of the culture, I actually just lose respect for it, because I can't help but think this is completely hypocritical. Yeah. You're dismissing discrimination one way, but you're completely against it from the other side of today's culture. And I haven't heard a coherent argument in favor of that, other than this sort of nebulous idea about power, which is a sort of averaging out of a collective power, including mainly economic, that has sort of been calculated over a long expanse throughout history, when today, as you say, that a lot of men don't live this stereotypical privileged life. This is a small select few who are the CEOs and the millionaires and the extremely famous or extremely good-looking men. And I understand. Okay, so the argument may be, okay, you may not consciously experience it, but you are part of a group that has these privileges that you're maybe unaware of. And again, I'm open to that, but I'm yet to hear a really sort of exact and coherent list of what these may be. And when you do come back with other things that men do experience disproportionately, such as violent assault, like women experience sexual assault far more than men do, but then men experience violent assault far more than women do. And do you really have to start comparing these things? I mean,
when people do that,
crime is a crime, pain is pain. It's frustrating.
Yeah, I remember seeing a comment argument in one of my posts where it was just like one person arguing that being murdered is worse than being raped, and I'm like, both of you lose this one. Like, what is the point in that? Like, it's not a competition who has it worse. And there certainly are privileges of being a man. Massive privileges that I experience and you will experience. Largely, I feel like male privileges. I talked about how calling it toxic attitudes towards masculinity is a useful change of language. I feel like calling it gender norms instead of patriarchy is a useful change of language. And when it comes to male privilege, it's an easy one. Just call them male privileges, because that insinuates there are privileges outside of just being a man, and there certainly are. Like, being a man, the privileges are mostly around competency, where men are just seen to be more competent than women, which is not true, especially in work. Like, if you need something to do, people often go to men because women are seen as less competent, which is completely sexist and problematic and not something I subscribe to. But female privileges are often more around being seen as more, their health and safety is more important than men's. And I think there's so many ways in which that can be observed quite clearly. And I mean, I've been recipient of massive privileges in terms of my gender, but I've also been a recipient of disadvantages too. And that's just life. And we only talk about one side.
Yeah, sure. I know I've definitely experienced things that I would only have experienced being a man, and there's certain things I've not had to endure, which are extremely negative, that I am, well, I don't know if grateful is the right word there, but I like to think I'm aware of, or I'm open to being even more aware of it. And how much do you think this is a sort of people tied into a certain identity, coming full circle, I suppose we touched on this at the start of this chat. People are tied to their identity, and there are certain aspects of that identity that they're not willing to question. So I know a couple of years ago, really internalized the idea that I am not going to get to a certain point in my career because I'm not white, I'm not going to have certain things because I'm not white. And then I actually started questioning it and thought, well, hang on a minute. Where did that come from? Where is the actual evidence, clear evidence that shows me I'm not capable of something a white man is capable of? And then I rid myself of that idea because it's harmful and it sort of, I would then assume racism everywhere. When someone looked at me, gave me a dirty look, I'd assume racism. When people didn't laugh at a comedy gig, I'd even go so far as to say, well, maybe they were just racist, or a girl rejected me at the club. I think, oh, it's because I'm not
Racist.
white, and exactly, and it was a way to just absolve myself of personal responsibility. Really, at the end of the day, I didn't ask myself, well, hang on, maybe the way I asked her out or the way I approached her was not attractive at all. No, it was just, if I was a white guy, she would have gone for me. And it's just kind of victim mentality that it's not fun, it's not healthy, it's extraordinarily negative. It rubs off on the people around you, and you shouldn't have to live that way, because there's so many subjective instances where, okay, if you really break it down, you could maybe make an argument that there's some form of racism that's occurring here. For example, if someone doesn't offer a seat for me on a bus or a train. Now, how can I actually prove that's racism? To me, now I'm at a point where, it's only racism if it's very clearly racism. I'm really interested in astronomy, and they have this saying there where it's only aliens when it's aliens. So it has to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And I think that's a good sort of mentality that I'm going to adapt into this. Now, I know this is different to the gender conversation. I'm not saying race and gender are the same here at all, but I think that mentality clearly has parallels. And I think education and much of the culture now is sort of instilling this idea into a lot of young people. How do we allow people to think critically and help them facilitate change in the way they see themselves and their position in the world?
It's a difficult conversation to have, because I don't like equating race to gender, like you said, because
I know,
because I'm white, and I feel like being a man isn't the same as being white. I personally think being white is just a pretty much universal advantage across the board in the UK. Like I can't observe any disadvantages. But I do think there are disadvantages.
In 2021, do you think?
Well, I'm open to being wrong. I'm open to being wrong.
Yeah.
I mean,
okay.
White boys are the least likely to go into higher education in the UK, and the most likely are Asian women. But I don't think white people are being discriminated against in education. I think that's because people from Asia are more likely to be from wealthy backgrounds. To immigrate from Asia to the UK, you're more likely to come from a wealthy background, and you're more likely to come from parents that are a bit more motivated. More likely, not always. So I feel like that's a much better explainer of why Asian women are at the top, and then followed by Asian men, and then white girls, and then white boys at the bottom. I mean, I could have easily looked at those stats. I mean, like racism against white people, but I think there's better ways of explaining it, like the ones I just gave. So, although I am open to being wrong, I don't think I'm disadvantaged for being white in the UK today. And I would love to have a conversation if you think I am wrong. But I do think I do think I experience disadvantages because I'm a male, and I feel like there's that for me they're significant and not small. Not the inability to cry, but the systemic, entrenched sexism against men. But I don't know where the disadvantages of being white, and I always find it annoying when someone's like, "Oh, what does a white man have to complain about?" I'm like, it doesn't nothing to do with being white. It's entirely being a men, and often.
Sure.
But what do you think? Why do you think I'm disadvantaged? I mean,
no. I wasn't saying that you were disadvantaged, but I was just wondering whether you think it's an advantage. I think that they're different there. Where I don't know what. Look,
I don't know.
It is a very nuanced conversation to have, because there are certain stereotypes that people may hold, but I think we're at a point now where, especially for young people, other stereotypes have almost counterbalanced those. Where, if a white guy from a private school does something heinous, it's immediately typical privileged white guy from a private school, and his sort of experience isn't afforded that same degree of complexity. So, no, I wasn't trying to say that I think white people are a disadvantage. If it came across that way, I'll take that back. But I just wonder, I wonder whether adopting a mentality of seeing discrimination or automatically assuming discrimination without any clear empirical evidence, I think that's really unhealthy, because I can only, again, just attest to what I went through and how I saw myself in the world. And there are just so many things now that I look back on and I say, oh, no, that wasn't racism. That was me. That wasn't racism. That was me. It was an identity I had sort of internalized, an identity where I didn't want to be challenged. I didn't like the idea that maybe I should have taken more responsibility, or maybe there are certain flaws I may have. And that mentality, regardless of, which identity that mentality is sort of being espoused by, but I just think that mentality is really unhealthy, and I see it a lot.
That I agree with. Now, I agree, starting any journey from a view set of being a victim is sort of destined for failure. I know I work a lot as a filmmaker, a documentary filmmaker, and often I'm given lists of people to interview. And so many of the women I interview have said to me, oh, I'm just here because I'm a woman. And although that does happen sometimes, most of the time they're not. And I'm always like, but so many are like, I'm just here to make up the numbers because I'm a woman. I'm like, no, you're an excellent physicist, and that's why you're here. That's why you're here. I don't care if you're a man or a woman. I don't care. You're excellent. You've done some great things. You've got some brilliant ideas. You're likable. You're articulate. That's why you're here. And I have to spend so long like talking them out of this victim mentality where they see themselves as just weak or submissive, or they're just told that they will never succeed because they live in this patriarchal system that is oppressing them in the West. And I think that's it's kind of cruel and it's disrespectful. I wouldn't want to start from that sort of perspective. I don't think that's a great place to begin a journey. Similar for boys. Boys are like, well, boys are the opposite way. You're part of the problem. Anything you do is going to be because you're privileged rather than because they're brilliant. And the victim mentality, I don't like it. No. And I try to keep that my tone of voice out of that. Although I'm sure I get it wrong, and sometimes I probably do come across as a victim. But no, there's some really good voices, emerging voices. Africa Brooke, who I think you follow as well, who can speak a lot more eloquently with experience about identity politics within race. But I don't think it's particularly helpful saying women can't do anything for themselves and they can't contribute. They don't contribute to society, and they don't play a part in the problems we've created. And like everything's been done by men. All bad things have been done by men, and it's just like, I don't know. Women contributed plenty to society, and they will do, and they continue to do so. But yeah, no, the victim mindset doesn't seem to be particularly helpful and less relevant. I do feel like we need to, if we're seriously going to use patriarchy as a worldview, I feel like we need to establish when is it smashed. Because we've been smashing it for 50 years, 60 years. But when is it smashed? When is it smashed? And like no one knows. It's just like we'll just keep smashing it until it's forever. And when's it over? When is it done?
That's a very fair point. For so many modern social justice movements don't have a clear end goal. I want to know, what's the end goal here? What do you want to achieve? What are the statistics you want to get to? Yeah. And then we can all work together in a pragmatic way to try and achieve that. But it seems to me, it feels like that people have tied their identity into being part of a victim class, and therefore actually may even get to a point where they self-sabotage. I know I would even draw parallels to there's a common trope in relationships that there are people who are the victim narcissist, and this is the person who will always blame the world for their failures and never actually take responsibility and always feel, act like they're useless and can't do anything, and when you first meet people like that, it can come across as very endearing and almost cute. Like, oh, look, you're not that bad. Come on, like, you're fine. But when you delve deeper into it, it is a form of narcissism. And like with some of those other terms that are just, thrown about, I'm not a huge fan of some of those pop psychology terms like narcissistic and even gaslighting and these sorts of ones that people use a lot. I think they have a place, but they're also overused. But I see a lot of parallels there. I see a lot of parallels on social media, people who just have fallen in love with their suffering and are not willing to look outside of that box. And I want to try and, if there's one thing I want to do with conversations like this and even just what I do online, generally speaking, I want to try and, facilitate that change of thinking, that change of consciousness, and allow people to question their own beliefs and not just question other people's beliefs, but beliefs about themselves. And I think you're doing that incredibly well. And one last question. Where do you think dating is going with the modern conversation about gender? How is this and then also you take into account all the apps like Tinder and Bumble and Hinge. What do you think is happening in the dating landscape?
I feel like I do generally feel like I'm judged for who I am. I feel like because I'm tall and because I'm reasonably successful, I am often viewed as more favourably, and I could be a real arsehole despite those things. A lot of successful people are arseholes. I feel like I'm on the advantage side of whatever it is I'm going to describe, but I do feel like it can be very difficult for men. I feel like it can be very difficult for men to find a mate or partner because maybe they don't fall into his requirements and we're less willing to challenge them. I think a lot of women judge men in dating a lot on their success and on money and status. I remember having my experience with those apps. I remember sending a photo of, I think I was holding something like this, and I was wearing a watch, not this watch, but like a reasonably expensive watch, and she noticed it. She was like, "Wow, that's a nice watch." And then instead of talking about the thing I was photoing, we were just talking about this watch. And then I remember talking to I had another friend try and set me up with her friend. And then I remember I talked to her once on the phone, one time only. And to be fair, she was drunk. The first thing she said to me was, "How tall are you?" Literally, the first thing. She was like, "How tall are you?" And I was just like, okay. And I think I gave her a joke answer. And then she's like, "Do you own any assets?" And I was just like, what? I was like, give the phone back to give your phone back to you. Let's piss off.
You didn't mess around.
And I was just like, what? You boiled me down to my height and my bank account. And I was like, you know what? You're not for me. We're not compatible. See you later. But I know there's been some research where women are a lot more selective than men in the swiping department. Men are more likely to swipe right, which is just the least surprising research ever. Like men are just like, but women, I imagine, are a lot more precious of their swiping. I know I've sat with friends who are girls of mine, and we are equally attractive, me and this girl, and we've put our phones down, and we're like, I'm going to do 20 right swipes. I could do 50, and I'll maybe get one. And she'll do 20 and she'll get like 15, and I'm like, not being funny, we are objectively similar level of attractiveness. Maybe I'm even a little bit higher, but like it was just crazy. I was just like, it's so demoralizing. And then because men are just forced into this thing where they're just like, because there's no point like spending 5-10 minutes considering a swipe when there's like a 5% chance it's going to be a success. You might as well just go through them and then do the selection. And then that hurts women because they match with loads of men who have just gone blitz through, and then they feel demoralised, and they're probably even less willing. They're probably going to be even more selective next time. But I don't know. I've given up on online dating. It's just I don't even know if I have the time for it. And once they find out, I've had some really great dates with women, especially feminists, which is hilarious because like we are actually very compatible in dating. Like I've seemed to just date feminists now, and some of them, the ones that do like the page, this is so great, so great. I have so many great dates. Like there could be like a TV program about us talking about it because they're so interesting, the conversations. And
yeah,
so I
for
mean,
a great podcast.
not all of them. It's not all of them. Certainly not all of them. Some of them just disappear.
Some of them.
And I'm just like, by the way, I write this blog. Check it out. And then a lot of them just be gone. I'm like, okay, well, get it over and done with before there's any sort of emotional connection between us. But
Fair.
It's just funny. I mean, I think feminists and myself are very similar in the sense that we're very passionate about politics and gender, and we actually want to get to the same place, which is total equality of the sexes. We just have slightly different routes, and working out how our routes are different is a very interesting thing to do on a date. And but dating,
I like that though.
I think men judge women more on their looks. Women judge men more on their sort of worth and their productivity and wealth, but not all women and not all men. But we're talking generalised terms, and there's certainly research to prove that. What do you think? How's it been for you?
Well, I've had a strange road. I mean, right now I'm in a very lovely relationship. I have been for a while, and thank God. Excellent. Because I was getting very frustrated with the apps, and then there was the sliding into the DM. Now, again, I'm someone who has a lot of followers and has a profile and is sort of reasonably known in Australia, so I'm sure that has contributed to women being interested. So it's hard for me to say exactly. Funnily enough, you mentioned the height thing because I'm a short guy. I'm about 5'7", and like I said before, I don't actually have an issue if women have a height preference, especially if they're taller than me. I can understand how that may not be physically appealing, but what is frustrating is the hypocrisy when a man might say, okay, like I don't particularly like maybe her weight, right? Mm-hmm. This is one where it's it's quite politically incorrect, but the man's an arsehole, he's judgmental, yet if a woman is blatantly discriminating based on height, which is, by the way, something you can't control, so in many ways it's worse, then it's perfectly normal and it's perfectly fine. So that sort of hypocrisy there again, I just find strange, and I just sort of raise my eyebrows at. But some of the trends I've seen with dating, especially with online dating, it just the casualization of dating, and more people are less willing to engage in sort of longer term relationships. What's happening is then it's almost becoming this. It's funny if you look at someone. An article I read in Quillette a year or two ago actually made a sort of Gini coefficient of men and how much sex they're getting in a large city. And it had a Gini coefficient, a sort of disparity similar to some of the most unequal countries in the world in terms of their wealth disparity. So there's this small slither of men right at the top that are getting all the likes and all the attention, it seems to be. And then the vast majority of men are not really getting much attention. Now, is that actually a problem? Who knows? Because, look, if that is just the result of a sort of a society that is afforded women a lot more agency, then, well, how do you change? You can't meddle in something like that. Like, what are you supposed to do? I actually had a joke about that. In 10 years, the government will be having sex quotas for men under a certain height. But, I mean, obviously that's never going to actually happen. So it's just very interesting to think about, because you can't force someone to be attracted to someone that they're not innately attracted to. So I don't know what to do about it, but it does look like it's trending towards a much more unequal dating market and a lot of people who can't find a partner.
Yeah, I mean, my last experience on those apps was like, you don't have to, but you can, and often are encouraged to share your height and obviously your job, and also if you're interested in having kids. But there doesn't seem to be much motivation for, like, you know, body weight or whatever, typical things that guys would traditionally find more desirable in a mate. It does seem to be a little bit more focused in that way. I just think women are more selective in dating, and I get that's an interesting one. How does that relate to sort of biology or culture or both? and why, if they are more selective, why? And I think a lot of it's because the physical consequences of sex are paid by women. They're the ones that are putting themselves in danger. I don't mean like actual physical danger in terms of violence. I'm talking about if they become pregnant, they're the ones that pay that burden. The guy can just have as much sex as he wants, really, and just piss off. But a woman can't do that because they're the ones that have the burden of rearing a child in pregnancy. So that explains for me a lot of the reasons why women might be more selective, and that's actually quite a reasonable way to think. And whether that feeds into why men feel and often are more neglected on dating apps because women are more selective, I feel like it's worth reminding as men it's not because you're not attractive or desirable. It's just because of these biological influences that women are dealing with, and they're the ones that pay the price for sort of having sort of sex, really. And I mean, there's a lot more to say about that in terms of how does that feed into male disposability and that sort of thing. But perhaps another day.
Yeah, another conversation, but we'll wrap this one up
Yeah.
there. That has been a really good chat, 90 minutes.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
George,
pleasure.
where can people find you? So obviously we know at the Tinmen. I'll put the links in the description, but you're also, you make documentaries. Is there anywhere we can see some of those, or any other social channels that you have?
I'm trying. No, it is just the Tinmen. So at the Tinmen, one word, on Instagram. There's a website that has been kindly built for free by a fan, which is going to be the tinmen.blog. That isn't ready yet.
Okay.
But as for documentaries, I'm trying to bring in my documentary filmmaking into the Tinmen. Like, people go mad for all my content, but that's not my job. My job is actually filmmaking. So hopefully they'll go even more mad for that. The ultimate ambition of the Tinmen is research and development for feature-length documentary. I'm trying to work out what sort of language works, how do men feel, how do we have this discussion in a way that is actually inclusive and progressive and contemporary, and then what sort of talking points resonate with people, and how do we move forward. And then I'm going to start bringing in men to share their experiences on camera, sort of short films, just talking about the male experience. I have this great idea of like interviewing men about what it's like to be a man, and then they'll give me like a vocal answer. And then I'm going to sort of ask them to visualize it with I'm thinking like clay, like a ball of clay. How does it feel? Show me how your mental health feels through this sort of tactile object. And then through that, I just want to start building a feature film, a feature documentary that is the result of years and years of research and development. But yeah, I'm going to keep tuned for that. I don't know when that's going to be. We're talking 5 years probably, but it could be sooner. Things are growing really fast. That. And I just think I don't want to be, like I said, I don't want to be just a rectangle on your phone. I want to be on TV screens, and I think bringing my professional skills as a filmmaker and my connections within the film industry, and then filtering that through these perspectives on masculinity and politics, I think could create a really great film. I'm looking forward to it, and I think it will naturally build itself. So keep an eye on the blog, and I'm going to be doing more of that in the future. It's just a matter of time because I'm just so busy at the minute doing actual filmmaking, but. That's the dream. That's the ambition.
Wow. I look forward to that. I can't wait to see that.
Thank
good
you.
luck. And if everyone watching this, go and follow the Tinmen on Instagram. George, thank you very much. And hopefully we can have another chat sometime soon and see where things are at.
I'd love to, yeah. Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you. Thank you for having me on, Neel. It's been great.